An apparent paradise in Italy, designed to hold an all-powerful prisoner.
That was reserved for Mafia bigwigs, including one of the top mafiosi in Italy at the time.
A Maltese fortress with hidden depths.
These old tunnels formed the basis for a network of underground spaces that would save an incredible number of lives.
An industrial monster lost in the Alaskan tundra.
It's half structure, it's half machine, it's a burnt-out carcass, and you wonder what this was used for, what its purpose was.
And scattered remains both above and below ground on a beautiful Korean island.
This shoreline is honeycombed with these caves. That there is something more to this island than being a tropical paradise.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. On the shoreline of Malta is a site that's watched over the capital city of Valletta for centuries.
You see old forts all across Europe, but this is something different, something unique.
This is a fortress that is lavishly designed, expensively designed, to not only be functional, but also be beautiful.
Originally built to face one old enemy, certain features betray a more recent call to arms.
The closer you get, the more you can see it's actually a little bit of a patchwork of buildings. They've had to rebuild and change things and re-fortify.
But the fort itself is only a part of this story.
Nearby, there are tunnels hidden beneath the streets and buildings of the city. They're dark, wet, and humid, and got a spooky feeling about them.
It's almost like a little underground labyrinth beneath the city.
So what connects these two places? And how would they work together in Malta's most desperate time of need? Originally home to an order of Christian knights, in 1565, just over a decade after being constructed, the fort was facing an unrelenting attack by the Ottomans.
The knights were vastly outnumbered. It was something like 35,000 against less than 10,000. It was a bloody and brutal conflict.
The siege lasted for almost a month. In the end, though, the invading forces broke through.
A last band of knights found themselves holed up in a chapel. They said their final prayers before heading out to face what was almost certain death.
Charles de Bono is the site's resident historian.
They were praying for their soul, you know. They were defending the religion, the Roman Catholic Church. So this chapel was very important for them as the last chance to pray before sacrificing themselves against the Turks.
The Ottomans finally took the fort, but couldn't hold on to the city, soon leaving the knights to reclaim and rebuild this place.
I mean, the fighting was so brutal that what you actually look at today is really constructed after this time. But if you hunt around the patchwork, you can find some remnants of the original constructs from this era.
This building here that we are is the only remaining part of the original fort, which was then later incorporated into the new Fort St. Elmo.
The Fort St. Elmo visible today tells of hundreds of years of preparation for war, because eventually the second siege of Malta would arrive.
Those extra towers and more modern additions, they show you what was to come. But that begs the question, was a centuries-old fort up to the task of dealing with a very modern kind of war?
The first stage of the reconstruction began in 1566. But the fort was, in fact, just one part of a far larger plan.
The fort wasn't the only piece of construction underway. The city itself was being rebuilt as well, and it all linked together.
So in order to build this lavish defensive facility around the harbor, the Knights of Malta commissioned the local Maltese builders to start quarrying the ground underneath.
As local historian Ryan Vella knows well, this was the starting point for the city's next chapter.
We are currently underneath the city of Valletta. The place we are visiting today was constructed way back during the Knights period in the late 16th century. Probably the rock that was cut from within this quarry was used to build the famous co-cathedral of St. John, which was the main church of the Order of the Knights.
As the city itself grew taller using the quarried stone, so too did the new fort.
There are lots of different quarries around the whole area. For example, beneath the area of Fort St. Elmo, you had the digging up of the ditch, which that rock was transformed into masonry stones in order to build the fort.
The lower section of the walls are from this early period of construction. But such fortifications weren't limited to this site alone. The walls extended all around the city, with this fort spearheading the defense. And it didn't stop there.
You can see the fort being rebuilt, but then there was an upgrade 1.1, you build it again. Upgrade 1.2, you go even higher, you make it more fortified. And the very fact that this particular strategic position was important did not change for centuries.
The underground quarries also evolved over the years, with the final and most surprising use occurring in the Second World War.
The place was first originated as a quarry, then it turned out to be changed over into a water reservoir. Later on, in the mid of the 20th century, it had another vital use, which was fully exploited by the Maltese community.
In the 1930s, with Malta under British control, final preparations were made both below and above ground. Tragically, it would be Fort St. Elmo that suffered the first blow in Malta's fight.
When Mussolini declared war on Britain and France on 10 June 1940, on the next day, the first Italian aircraft appeared over Malta and dropped their bombs. The event is important because the first soldiers were killed during the first day of attacks on Fort St. Elmo.
The second siege of Malta had begun. It would continue for over 2 years, and some 15,000 tons of bombs would fall from the skies.
They used the spaces to enlarge them and also to dig extra rooms in order to shelter their community over here.
People can immediately go underground and actually spend some hours, maybe even days, living in these small little holes that they've carved for themselves.
It was scary for sure because the electricity was very minimal. The place was overcrowded because you had the whole community going down here for shelter.
The city's foundations helped protect the people, but above ground, the old fort had its own role to play.
On the 26th of July, 1941, Italian naval ships were spotted approaching the fort and the Grand Harbour area. An attack was on the cards, and the guns were about to be put to use.
The twin 6-pound coastal guns hit their targets. There were only a handful of enemy vessels approaching that day, but the fort had done its job. A full invasion of the harbor was never attempted. It seems the defensive presence of the fort was enough to deter the enemy.
It was the same reason why the fort was built in 1552 and after the Great Siege of 1565. So the role of the fort remained important and relevant and very strategic till the Second World War.
Finally decommissioned in 1972, for over 400 years, the old fort had kept the harbor safe. Around 15,000 buildings were destroyed by the bombing of Malta, and tragically, more than 1,500 lives were lost.
If you look at the Maltese flag, you'll see the George Cross, the highest medal that the British Empire gives to civilians. And that medal was awarded to the entire population of Malta for standing up under relentless German and Italian bombardment throughout the Second World War.
In the northwest of Alaska lies an industrial wreck trapped in a frozen landscape.
For people who weren't indigenous, this is a harsh landscape. It's bitter cold. There's snow, there's frost, there's ice.
In stark contrast to its desolate surroundings stands an engineering giant.
It's hard to say what it is at first glance. It looks kind of like a building or a warehouse, but then it's got something that looks kind of like a crane off of one end.
So you've got this mad, giant steampunk setup. You've got all sorts of things going on.
The first question you have when you look at something like this is, who built this? Who brought this massive piece of equipment into the middle of nowhere? They must have been after something of extraordinary value to go to this absurd effort.
Rising from the flat and seemingly endless tundra, this industrial monument can be seen for miles.
As you approach, you see the top, the frame peeking out. You see rusted metal. It's the skeletal structure that you wonder whether it's meant to help extract something from the earth.
Bob Hefner worked on this contraption for 25 years and still remembers the first time he laid eyes on it.
So the first time I seen one of those, I came here working for the airlines, and we were flying over the tundra, and it was just bare tundra for miles. And then we came over the top of a hill and seen what looked like a small village, and everything sitting there. And I asked the pilot, I said, "What is that?" He said, "A dredge camp."
This is Dredge number 5, a modern solution to a centuries-old problem: how to pull gold out of the ground. It's found less than 5 miles outside the city of Nome, once a lawless frontier town and site of the last great North American gold rush.
This is Nome, Alaska, a city that sprang up out of almost nothing practically overnight for one reason: gold.
In September 1898, they discovered gold in this area. Suddenly, gold prospectors came in from Europe, from the rest of America, from San Francisco, from Seattle, and even from as far away as Australia.
Just getting to Nome was an adventure of a lifetime. From Seattle, it was either a treacherous 2-week boat ride or an even longer land journey. Finding the gold when you had arrived, though, was surprisingly simple.
Here in Nome, a few prospectors realized they could literally find gold on the beach.
The very fact that the gold was found on a beach here That information flew around the world, yeah? Because if anyone was looking for gold, it's hard work and you have to stake your claim. But on a beach, there are no claims. It's every man for himself.
Within just a few months, this little village of Nome had turned into a city of 20,000 people.
This new city was a wild and boisterous place.
It had its bars, it had its clubs, it had its brothels. This was a rough, tough frontier town.
Alaska still was a territory, it wasn't a state, so there wasn't much law up here. Eventually, they sent in a contingency of the army to try to keep rule. It's a lot of claim jumping, a lot of backstabbing, you know, gold, especially when you get hungry, can turn men into something that we don't want to admit we are.
At the turn of the 20th century, searching for gold here was mostly a very basic manual process.
They had simple means, what's called a rocker, and a bucket that they would flow water over the top and put some dirt in there and shake it back and forth while they add a little bit of water to it. It teaches you patience.
Tolerance of this painstaking method did not last long. Prospectors and engineers soon began looking for more efficient ways to extract the gold.
As the easy pickings got taken, bigger companies started moving in with serious investment in machinery.
It takes on a more industrial scale that becomes a different beast, really, a more rationalized way of extracting the resources from the land.
Dredge number 5, built in 1941, was a new breed of machine that revolutionized the hunt for gold. It could dig deeper, faster, and longer than any human with a pick and shovel.
On the front of the dredge here, you can see the bucket line, which is a lot like a chainsaw. It is a series of buckets linked together and rotates in a big circle driven by a motor on the dredge, and it picks up the material from the pit.
But it did more than simply dig. It was a factory too. Inside the dredge, larger rocks were filtered out before the gold was then separated from this finer mixture by running water through a sluice box.
A lot of fine gold would wash out, which is what we really have around Nome here. It's mostly a real fine gold, like salt, pepper, shaker kind of sized pieces.
If you could move enough material every day, it could be worth investing a huge amount of money in building a dredge like this.
But there was only so much gold in one place. The dredge needed access to untapped ground.
What's amazing about these dredges, and if you haven't seen one, I think this is the incredible thing, is that they move.
There's no way you could put big enough wheels on this thing to roll across this rugged terrain. But if you can dig a pond, then you can float the dredge. And then you can keep expanding your pond as you move forward.
But the frozen ground surrounding the dredge was a major obstacle. Thawing it involved the construction of huge ditch lines that brought water in from 70 miles away. And once afloat, moving the dredge was still a complex procedure.
What we have on the sides here, what you're looking at, is the winch lines that are there to pull the boat back and forth. There's a series of winches that one pulls forward, two pull sideways like this.
Incredibly, this mechanical beast actually walked.
And what it has on the back that you can't really see from this angle are two spuds. One spud would drop down and lift the other one up, and so it would alternate and walk. The dredge would walk forward.
Shuffling this giant structure even a few meters was a huge amount of work. But all this effort was worth it when gold was struck.
There's nothing more satisfying when you get that first bit of gold and it's in your hands and you're looking at it and this is yours and you can take that almost anywhere in the world and use that for money.
Despite its decades of success, the profitable years would not last.
Often the price of the thing that you're mining is going down. There are people mining it all over the world. The supply is increasing. You're not getting as much out of the ground. That's not a great combination.
It extracted millions of dollars of gold from the ground here, and the town of Nome has survived and thrived over the years because of it.
Shut down in 1996, Dredge number 5 now lies as a silent reminder of a golden age. For people like Bob, it's not just the hunt for gold that keeps them here. It's something that runs a little deeper.
I love Nome. I love the region. I love the people. And so I don't really plan on retiring anywhere else. If I made my million, I'll spend it here at the grocery store.
On the island of Jeju, off the southern tip of South Korea, is an area littered with strange features.
They look almost natural in their way. They're kind of carpeted in grass, but they're too symmetrical and they're laid out in some kind of a pattern.
You can see one after another, more than a dozen of these structures, which are not part of the terrain.
These unusual forms, however, are not alone.
Looking along the coast, we see these evenly spaced caves dug into the rock of the island and sort of disappearing into the island out of sight. Very symmetrical, all sort of the same size openings, so they don't look like natural caves.
These cave structures are all over the island. This shoreline is honeycombed with these caves.
Forgotten for years, only recently has the full picture been pieced together.
You start to see that this whole island might be hiding something.
These strange little hillocks on the plateau, these strange caves along the coast, they all tie together in the same story.
The first clue to what happened here is found within these small grass-covered mounds that date back to the Second World War.
If we look at the actual opening into these hills, it's shaped like an aircraft with a cutout for the fuselage and for the wingspan. So basically, these are hangars.
Local resident Lee Yun-hyung has scoured this land for clues relating to the site's past life, when Korea was under Japanese occupation.
There were fighter planes in this hangar, like Zero-Sen fighters or naval bombers. A total of 36 hangars were built on this airfield.
While today, the surviving 20 hangars are the most prominent reminders of this time, hidden all around are other ruins.
There is an airfield runway, an underground bunker, anti-aircraft bunkers, and many other facilities within a 1 kilometre radius of the airfield. Such a concentration of military facilities like this is hard to find anywhere else.
These are the remains of Aldru Airfield, a key part of Japan's Operation 7 defenses.
Number 1 to number 6 were operational areas in mainland Japan. However, only Jeju Island was included in number 7.
Most of what we're seeing here is infrastructure from late in the Second World War, when Japan shifts its focus to defending the Japanese home islands from Allied invasion.
Jeju was the only place outside of Japan that was included in the mainland's final defensive plans. That shows how much Japan valued the defense of Jeju Island.
From the moment the occupation of Korea began in 1910, Japan had ruled with an iron fist. For those living in the south of Jeju, the regime's brutal approach was felt with the establishment of this airfield.
The first phase of the airfield's construction began in 1926. There were 6 villages here in Daejeong-guk. and the residents from each of those villages were evicted to make space for this airfield.
Japan's treatment of the locals on Jeju was like their treatment of the locals everywhere they occupied. It was absolutely brutal. They would force all the men into slave labor, and the women of Jeju were forced into prostitution, the famous comfort women that the Japanese military demanded to take care of their soldiers.
So when the Japanese armed forces decide that they need to use this area for an airfield, they shave it flat, and they do that not by using industrial machinery, which is in short supply, but by using Korean forced labor.
There were hills all over. However, many residents of Jeju were called up for forced labour to flatten the landscape here. The workers lived around here and did not have much to eat. There was a lot of hunger, and there were many casualties in the process.
Japan held little regard for the locals' well-being. Their focus was firmly fixed on exploiting this island's potential. A potential that explains why Jeju became so important to their later defensive plans.
If you look at Jeju Island on a map, it's just in an unbelievably strategic location. It's right smack in the middle of the East China Sea between Japan and mainland China. If you wanted to build a base that would allow you to dominate that whole region, this is where you'd put it.
In the 1930s, Japan was on the front foot and looking to expand, as they did with the invasion of China in the Sino-Japanese War.
When Japan goes to war with China, they need forward air bases. This is an ideal spot because it takes you partway to China so that targets in Manchuria are brought within the range of Japanese air power.
But a few years later, when Japan was losing ground in the Second World War, the role of the island was flipped on its head.
The airfield was originally built by Japan because of the site's geographical importance. That's why Japan's strategy was to think of Jeju Island as an important defensive base for the Japanese mainland battles, and to devise and prepare for the mainland showdown.
It's envisioned more and more as a sort of Iwo Jima-type place, where the Japanese will mass ground troops to fight a last stand against the Americans who will be forced to attack it because of its strategic location.
In January 1944, there were just 300 Japanese troops stationed on Jeju. But that number was about to skyrocket.
By mid-1945, there are 70,000 Japanese troops on the island, a third of the total number of Japanese troops on the whole Korean peninsula.
The Japanese defense concept was that the invader might land on the island, but that the island might then become a living hell for them.
Once again, the local population was forced to carry out back-breaking work, as a new network of defenses and subterranean bases were carved out of the island.
This is a large underground bunker built by the Japanese. It was big enough for vehicles to pass through. There were important facilities here, including the command headquarters of the airfield and a torpedo storage facility.
This single underground facility stretches on into the darkness for 3/4 of a mile. But it was just a fraction of the true extent of the defenses hidden beneath the surface.
In Jeju, there are about 700 underground tunnels dug by the Japanese during the Pacific War.
As the so-called Operation 7 got underway, the foremost defensive tunnels were cut right into the island's cliffs, and they harbored a deadly weapon.
They begin carving out these caves for these mini-submarines that will launch undersea kamikaze attacks against American warships.
These bases were used to station boats loaded with over 500 pounds of explosives. They would be driven by a soldier and used as a suicide bomber boat against the US ships.
The idea that somebody might give his life in order to sink an American destroyer using himself as part of a weapon, that idea was genuinely disturbing to Americans and very effective, both as a propaganda tool and as a military reality.
In the last years of the war, it's estimated that over 7,000 naval personnel were killed by aerial or seaborne kamikaze attacks. It was a devastating tactic, but it came at a huge price. And it may help explain why so many of these military positions here are still intact.
In a way, though, all these kamikaze missions might have backfired on the Japanese. It convinced the Americans that the Japanese military would never surrender, that they would fight to the last man.
Taking the Japanese home islands to end the war would have killed millions. Using atomic bombs to end the war killed thousands. The choice wasn't easy, but the choice was clear. The Allied invasion of Jeju at the beginning of the Allied invasion of Japan, that carnage was avoided.
What remains on Jeju are some of the best examples of Japanese Pacific War infrastructure still in existence. And now, these remnants from that brutal occupation have a far greater purpose.
I hope people around the world will recognise these facilities as places to reflect on that original war of aggression, the violation of the human rights of those enslaved, and the importance of peace.
Off the coast of Sardinia is an 11-mile-long sliver of land, a haven for nature and wildlife.
This island is a bit of a paradise. The lush vegetation, the waters. It's no surprise that it's a national park.
When you first come on the scene, this looks like an idyllic Mediterranean island with little rocky outcrops and olive trees.
Yet beyond this pastoral beauty lies a series of abandoned buildings. Although virtually uninhabited by man today, they suggest the island once housed a significant population.
One particular building looks like it might almost be a monastery or a religious retreat. It's very inward facing, but then you see the barbed wire, you see the guard towers. Inside you see the locked doors. You realize this is no monastery.
8 miles away, at the northern end of the island, is a second structure with strange design features.
The closer you look, you realize that this wasn't just any old prison. You have these huge high walls, the guard towers, the spotlights, and just one tiny hatch for an entrance.
Within its outer walls, the mystery deepens.
There are hardly any windows or openings to speak of. And from above, you can see there's a secondary inner structure, almost a prison within the prison. Whoever was held here was dangerous indeed.
So how are these two sites linked? And who was locked up at the heart of this complex? On the southern end of the island, a large rectangular building is ominously surrounded by searchlights, metal bars, and smashed guard huts. Today, access inside is strictly forbidden, but former prison guard Gian-Maria de Rive remembers what life was like for those on the inside.
Less freedom, less space. The procedures are really strict. So they can't leave the building at all. Everything takes place inside.
This is Fornelli Prison. a maximum security facility where guards like Gian Maria could keep inmates on a tight leash.
Bringing them to an island on an island. We could say it was like cutting the umbilical cord.
Separated from the mainland by 180 miles of open sea, the Italian government saw the potential of this site as a place to lock up Italy's most dangerous criminals.
Originally, it was a judiciary sanatorium and tuberculosis hospital. But then with the emergence of red and black terrorism in Italy, the government decided to turn this facility into a supermax prison.
Extreme left-wing groups known as Red Terrorists were leading a wave of violence across Italy in the late 1970s. Revolutionaries attempting to overthrow the capitalist state and force Italy's withdrawal from NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
They had homegrown, ultra-left-wing terrorist groups like the Red Brigades that were literally going to war against the country and against the government.
In 1978, they even assassinated former Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro. As members of the organization were rounded up in response, the government increasingly turned to the isolated island of Asinara and used Fornelli as a dumping ground.
They sent so many members of the Red Brigade to the Fornelli Prison that it became a huge focus of the group to get those people released.
September 1979, a clash broke out on the streets of Rome.
There was a huge shootout between Red Brigade forces and the authorities. And when one of them was captured, he had on him this whole elaborate plan for a mass escape from the Fornelli prison. They were going to smuggle in machine guns, they were going to have motorboats, they were going to overwhelm the prison and get all these prisoners out.
The plan had been scuppered, but members of the brigade inside Fornelli took matters into their own hands. Rioters destroyed cells and smashed sections of the building.
They had packed their stove-top coffee machines with explosives and plastic. They had managed to create real bombs.
Riot police on horseback surrounded the maximum security wing.
There were tense moments, but you weren't supposed to show fear.
Tear gas was launched into the heart of the uprising.
The Red Brigade attempted a rebellion and then tried to leave the facility, but they failed. They surrendered at about 3 a.m.
The riot had been quashed, but soon after, without warning, the authorities transferred all the terrorists off the island. They began replacing them with Italy's new public enemy #1, Mafia bosses. But to handle them, they were going to need a new facility.
At the end of the day, we were selected. 500 guards were chosen because of this situation.
Enrico Moreau was selected as head guard of a new specialized facility. Lookout towers stood at each corner, while walkways around the perimeter left no area out of sight. But at the center of the facility was one particularly strange feature.
A new area was added to the design, the bunker, built with reinforced concrete and surrounded with barbed wire.
The bunker was a singular prison within a prison, a tiny villa built within high stone walls and only one small entrance. It was designed to house just one man.
That's where the top mafia boss or bosses were sent, where they could really be isolated. You can keep an eye on them. You could also protect them from being executed by other forces or poisoned.
The bunker was reserved for the top dog, the last great Sicilian mafia chief, Salvatore Rina, who was the head of the Corleonese clan. They came from Corleone in Sicily, And that is famously associated with the Godfather trilogy.
Rina had gone to war with the state, targeting top officials and organizing terrorist-style bombings. As the government fought back, just as it had with the Red terrorists, this island became its main prison for mobsters. Rina was given 26 life sentences for the murder of hundreds of individuals. Two of Rina's victims, Enrico had known personally.
It was an awful experience for me. I found myself here, with Rina, the instigator of those murders.
Rina's influence was such that even within prison walls, he could wield great power.
For a lot of Americans whose idea about the Mafia comes from, the Godfather movies and things like that, it's hard to appreciate just how powerful the Mafia was up until really quite recent times. It was almost like a shadow government.
The surrounding area was patrolled by 100 agents. Boats crisscrossed the sea day and night. Threats from the sky were monitored with radar.
Controls within the bunker had to be equally watertight.
So every time we entered or left the bunker, we had to search each other. In fact, there were no friends allowed here.
Even his food was brought to him in a special briefcase to avoid attempts at poisoning.
We always hear a lot about codes of honor among the Mafia types, but history shows that provided with the right incentives, they'll turn on each other in a heartbeat.
Protocols were designed to prevent corrupt guards carrying out assassinations on behalf of rival mafiosi looking to take Rina's crown.
We couldn't carry cell phones or paperwork that might endanger you by revealing your identity. We couldn't talk or mention names of wives or daughters. Nothing at all. We talked only about the service. That was it.
Prison is brutalizing for everyone. These prisons were terrible places for the prisoners, but also for the guards who were in fear for their lives and so isolated, so far away from normal civilization. It had to have been a very rugged existence.
The real need for this extreme isolation was not about preventing escape, but getting them to turn informer.
They isolated them so thoroughly that the idea was they would realize, wait, if I'm facing 20 years where I can't talk to any of my associates, I can't do any of my former business, I might as well become an informant and maybe get out earlier.
Yet Rina never turned. Enrico hand-delivered his dinner in an armored briefcase every day for 4 years until the prison was closed down in 1997.
By the late 90s, the tide of violence from first the Red Brigades and then the Mafia was receding, and law enforcement was getting the upper hand, and they realized they didn't need this kind of ultra-security prison to the same degree.
The so-called beast lived out his days in a different prison in solitary confinement. At the time of his death in 2017, some claimed that Toto Rina was still operating as the head of the Sicilian Mafia. Today, Asinara is a national park, home to the rare albino donkeys that gave the island its name. The dilapidated prison structures are preserved as relics of a very different time, one that is thankfully consigned to the past.